Hey, I'm James, and I love the story of Zechariah. It's a narrative of a guy who has spent his life in service of God and the church. And yet when an angel, a messenger of God, shows up, he meets the angel with skepticism. The angel disrupts his pattern and life and causes him to reflect for 9 months. And it's in this disruption of pattern that the first words that pour out of his mouth after not talking for 9 months is exactly what God has done and what God continues to do. I find his story relatable. I've been walking with the Lord since I was 15. I've spent over half my life in service of the church and God. How long have you been walking with the Lord? Years? Decades? I think oftentimes we lose sight of what God has done. We get consumed with the moment, what often seems bleak. And instead of being filled with this joy and hope and how God has moved in our lives and the lives of others, we get bogged down with the here and now and consumed by it. And yet hundreds of times through Scripture, God instructs his people to remember because we're so prone to forget. I'm prone to forget, and in my forgetfulness, I become overwhelmed. I've been reading the Psalms, and in Psalm 77, there's this wonderful song from a guy who's forgotten. He's faced life, and it's been horrible and full of doubt and skepticism. In Psalm 77:7, he says something like this: "Will the Lord reject forever and never again show favor? Has his faithful love ceased? Is his promise at an end for all generations? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he, in anger, withheld compassion?" Selah. He pauses there and he lets this difficult question linger. And then he picks it up again in verse 11. He says this: "But I will remember the Lord's works. Yes, I will remember your ancient wonders. I'll reflect on all he has done, and I will remember what God has done, how he has been faithful. I will again turn towards the Lord." It's this thought of, I will remind myself, I will remind my soul that God has been good. And even now, even though it's not all good, God continues to be good. Zechariah's pause has freed up a lot of time for him to reflect on just how good God has been, on how good he continues to be. God has been loving, faithful, and kind, and moving towards his people, forgiving sin and error, establishing relationship with us in which we are known and wanted and forgiven and with God, known by God without fear. And even though Zechariah meets God's angel with a lack of faith, God is true to his word, both in the past and now. Like every year at Christmas, we come back to this truth and we sing the same songs. And for some of us, every year, perhaps it becomes less overwhelming, becomes less awe-inspiring. And perhaps that's because every year we become more overwhelmed with the season. The lights and the shows and the parties and the presents and the fake sense of cheer and Walmart. It's the drag of the season. And maybe like Zechariah, what we need is a pause, a break, a time of reflection, a time to remember and then share the story of God's faithfulness. So can I encourage you, take a pause, carve some time out this season to reflect. How have you seen God move? Both throughout history, which is wonderful, and in the history of your life. Take some time to remember, where have you seen God's faithfulness? Or write it down. Worship God through remembering. And then share it with someone. Share it with your family, with your kids. Tell the story of God's faithfulness in your life to your small kids, to your teens, to your adult children. Share it with your parents and your friends. Where has God answered your prayers? Where and when have you experienced God? Share those stories of faith with those around you to remind them, to remind yourself of how we serve a God who steps into our darkness, our past darkness, our current darkness, our future darkness, and he brings new life. Now celebrate this time of year. Don't celebrate the season. Celebrate that we have a God who has done and continues to do good. Celebrate and share the story of hope that God is crafting in his people.